Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti a questa serata dedicata a Dante's Inferno, Multiple Approaches. It's a great chance that we have to peek in the future of Dante studies. It's a group of brilliant doctoral students in our departments and not only, that have in common to have followed together a course on Dante's Inferno. And this is the result of their studying. And you will see that the topics that they will discuss are very original, some of the stuff that I would have never thought to associate to Dante. And I'm delighted that they've decided to do this for us here at Casa Italiana. I mentioned last week when we had one conference that was organized, convened, and moderated by one of our grad students. And 3 weeks ago when we inaugurated the exhibit that you have upstairs, completely different topic. It's about Italian fashion in the 80s, curated by one of our grad students. This is exactly what I had in mind when I thought what Casa Italiana could be. Not a place where we bring in the great names, the famous, and we give them a stage to present whatever they want to tell us. We still have to do that a little bit, especially when it comes to politics. Professoressa, eccola. Finisco la mia introduzione e poi ti do la parola. Ah no, nulla. Professor Maria Luisa Ardizzone, who is the mentor of these students. Please welcome her. Maria Luisa was saying how rewarding it is for me that the Casa becomes a showcase for what happens here intellectually. That is sort of a testament to the activity that go on here at the department. And the professors and the grad students especially, but also the undergrad students, are really the soul of this place. And I just hope that we are somehow able to give them the space and the light that they need to come out and to share with the rest of the population that is not academics what they're studying. This is really the role of the Casa, to create this link between academia and the rest of the world. And I'm very grateful that these students have decided to do this with us here tonight. As I mentioned, Professor Ardizzone is the professor with whom they studied. She's an expert in Dante and medieval studies, but also in contemporary poetry. And one of her main fil rouge in her study is the connection between philosophy, literature, and science. And that's how I met her about 30 years ago. We arrived 2-3 days of distance, yes, and we started working together, but immediately I was struck by the originality of her thought and of her research. And I think it is reflected in the work of these brilliant grad students. It's going to be a long evening, so we're going to start right away. The moderator of the first session is Filippo Fabbricatore from the Graduate Center at City University of New York. Filippo, prego, presenti.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event tonight entitled Dante's Inferno, Multiple Approaches. As the director of the Casa Italiana kindly said, this conference is the culmination of a graduate course on the Inferno taught by Professor Maria Luisa Ardizzone in fall 22. All of the speakers of tonight participated in the course, and we now present the research that those classes inspired. But I want to open the session with a big smile, a smile shared by all my classmates. This smile is for Professor Ardizzone. My colleagues and I are grateful to her for different reasons. One, for organizing this tonight, of course, but also for how her thought-provoking lectures have illuminated our understanding of Dante. But we are also thankful for the humanity of her teaching, a humanity that spread among us to the point that every Tuesday, at the end of each class, we kept talking upon Dante in front of a good pizza or a good drink. The professor contributed to create a cohesive group, and I'm sure you will feel this spirit tonight. What were colleagues are now friends: Stefano, Jose, Megan, Kate, Fabio, Dax, Giulia, and Michelle. Unfortunately, Giulia and Michelle couldn't be here today, and they're sorry for this, but I want to remember their work. With a paper entitled Mind in Flight, Julia Rosenfield analyzed the flight imagery in Dante's Inferno. Michel Fast, that today is right now in Berlin, worked on a paper entitled The Torturous Pleasure of Seduction, Desire and Transformation in Dante's Inferno. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers that made this conference possible. So, since the conference is rich of speakers, then we have the screening of the movie musiced by Stefano. Let's start right now. I introduce the first speaker, that is Stefano Scandella. Stefano will moderate also the second panel. He is a first-year PhD student here at NYU. He mostly focuses on Dante studies, Dante's reception in the early 19th century, and Foscolo's political and literary works. His presentation will show how the understanding of the English nonconformist Protestantism influence on Foscolo is decisive to interpret the main arguments and fundamental articulations presented in the Discorso sul testo della Commedia, the introduction to Foscolo's commentary on the Commedia, written between 1825 and 1827 in England. The title of the presentation is La divina missione, prescritta al poeta di riformare la religione, Dante as a Christian legislator in Foscolo's Discorso sul testo della Commedia. Thank you.
Grazie Filippo. Okay, so you can see the image here under the title is a reproduction of the Old manuscript 48, which dates from the second half, possibly the third quarter of the 14th century. And this is one of the very few Trecento manuscripts of the Commedia to provide a complete canto-by-canto program of illustration. And as far as we know, Foscolo never visited this collection, although his protege Antonio Panizzi, who had arrived in England in 1823, certainly did, and talked about it in some of his letters. This illustrazione represents a very important moment for Foscolo interpretation. It's a moment in Canto 24 of Paradiso, where Dante will receive the crown of Christian poet, crown of Christian. They are intertwined, so it's hard to say, from St. Peter, after hearing his profession of faith. So the outline of the presentation, it's three main points. First, Ugo Foscolo, an Italian in Regency, England, 1816-27, which is a sketch of Foscolo's arrival in London. Secondly, some information about Protestant circles in the second decade of the 19th century. And the last and main point, Foscolo reading of the Commedia. So the first point. Foscolo arrived in England by way of Switzerland and Germany in September 1816. The Italian exile already had a substantial reputation in Britain as a poet, and especially as the author of a famous epistolary novel, Ultime Lettere di Jacopo Ortis, the last letters of Jacopo Ortis. A few years later, in his best-known poem, De Sepolcri, published in 1806, Dante appears as Il Ghibellin Fuggiasco, the fugitive Ghibelline. The syntagma pronounced here is a kind of pre-announcement of the development of Foscolo's own anti-clerical neo-Ghibelline stance, which would later on help him to win the sympathies of the Whig Holland House circle during his own exile in England. So on September 22 of 1816, he had been introduced by Giuseppe Binda, born in Lucca, who was performing secretarial duties there at Holland House to Lord Henry Richard Fox, 3rd Baron Holland. This Holland House was one of the London's most famous political cultural circles. In Foscolo, his hosts and their friends, the elite of the Whig Party, the Liberal Party of England at that time, admired the literary celebrity in Foscolo, but also honored his image of a patriot and a free man who had bowed neither to the Austrians and nor earlier to the French Empire. So in spite of the fame, of this fame that preceded Foscolo's arrival in the most Babylonian of Babylonia, as he used to call London in some of his epistolary writing, Lady Holland introduced him not only as a famous writer and expert in classical literature, but also as a Milanese exile who left Italy to avoid taking the oath required by the Austrian authority. This alone was enough for him to be considered a libertarian and be welcomed in the Whig milieu at Holland House, even though nobody there seemed to know that his exile was actually more self-imposed than forced. At Holland House, Foscolo made acquaintance with such men as John Allen, the poet Samuel Rogers, the publisher John Murray, and the antiquary, poet, and politician Hudson Gurney. So let's focus briefly on the relationship between Foscolo and Hudson Gurney. Foscolo's close ties with the Society of Friends during the English years are evident. The Society of Friends, also called Friends Church or Quakers, is a Christian group that arose in mid-17th century England, dedicated to living in accordance with the inner light, or the direct inward apprehension of God, without creeds, clergy, or other ecclesiastical forms. As most powerfully expressed by George Fox, Friends felt that their experimental discovery of God would lead to the purification of all of Christendom. Hudson Gurney is the benefactor and patron thanked by Foscolo within the esergo of the Discorso. He writes, a Hudson Gurney, Ugo Foscolo questa edizione intitola meritatamente al suo nome il mio desire apparecchiava grazioso loco, Dante, Purgatorio 27. Hudson Gurney belonged to a prominent Quaker family of bankers. This indication allows us to highlight the importance of the dissenters and nonconformist Protestant community within English society. And I quote John Sykes here, Gurney's bank may be described as exercising an influence and a power inferior to that of no banking establishment in Great Britain than that of the Bank of England alone, excepted. We will come back later to the passage that I highlighted here on the left. So Foscolo's reading of the Commedia. Very brief introduction to this. The spread of interest in Dante in Italian culture increased considerably in the late 18th century and the beginning of the new century. The reason for this were due in particular to the fascination aroused by the stories and experiences in the grand tours undertaken by aristocratic and literary figures, together with the large presence of Italian exile in England. Renewed interest in the study of Italian coincided with a marked increase in English translation, editions of Italian authors, primarily Dante. It identified at its chronological height as one of the first modern authors, as well as emblem of the national tradition and founder of Italian literature and language. An examination of the situation of Dante's scholarship attests to a quite different state of health, namely a lack of critical study of the Commedia. And one of the main reasons behind this lack is clearly identified by Foscolo within the first of two articles on Dante published in the Edinburgh Review on the year 1818. He says, the poem of Dante is like an immense forest, venerable for its antiquity and astonishing by the growth of the trees which seem to have sprung up at once to their gigantic height by the force of nature, aided by some unknown heart. It is a forest, curious, roam the extensive region which it hides, but frightful from its darkness and its labyrinths. The first travelers who attempted to cross it have opened a road. Those who followed have enlarged and enlightened it, but the road is still the same, and the greater part of this immense forest remains, after the labors of 5 centuries, involved in its primitive darkness. Readers, especially foreign readers, believe on the faith of the commentators that they have seen the whole, like the readers of modern travels who fancy that they know a country from the description of those who have run through it with a road book and a dictionary and return home to republish their tour. So, through the evocative image of the Commedia, which is likened to an immense dark labyrinthine forest, the Foscolo compares the ancient commentators to the first pilgrims who traversed the forest and created a passageway, i.e. the first commentaries and interpretation to the poem. And subsequent commentators, through numerous, are instead accused of failing to significantly extend knowledge of this immense forest, which is the Commedia, which mostly remains shrouded in its original obscurity. In the final part of this passage, Foscolo reproaches modern readers and critics, particularly foreign ones, for relying on the interpretations of commentators without coming into direct contact with Dante's text, as do those who think they know a country only through the accounts of the people who have actually experienced and perceived this country. So now let's have a brief look on this letter from Foscolo to Lord Holland, which was his first Whig friend and supporter. Here he says, the part which I'm interested in, said, "I believe I have discovered an unknown land until now, because the historians of Italian literature have never dared to treat the subject of my age, too much connected with the affairs of the church." So in the letter, the importance assigned by the poet to l'histoire politique, religieuse, et littéraire is clearly stated. Such a historical approach, which as the 19th century progressed will become a fundamental assumption of literary criticism, is at this temporal height quite innovative, to say the least. And according to Foscolo, the task of commenting and amending Dante's text carries with it the ambition to offer Italians a model of a free poet, someone who is not afraid to speak, an exemplary genio gigante, great genius, from which to take steps to rebuild an Italian state free from Austrian rule, la dittatura tedesca or the German dictatorship. And as far as studies are concerned, free from the restriction imposed by the Jesuits' order, la dittatura ecclesiastica or the ecclesiastical dictatorship. So, upon a careful reading of the 211th section of Foscolo Discorso sul testo della commedia, the first book of his Dantean work, which is a supposed introduction before the study of the three cantiche, one primary thesis can be identified. The sacred poem was dictated for that mission, the reforming mission, which whether it was seen, I do not know, but it was never revealed by any of the interpreters. Nevertheless, to anyone who considers in the author of the poet rather than the legislator of religion, Dante in that century, I fear, will remain ill-known. So, for an adequate study of Dante's poem, it is necessary to always keep in mind the thesis of the missione riformatrice, the mission of reform. Since the purpose of the commedia is, according to Foscolo, to reform the Catholic Church, proteggendo la religione dal pastorale congiunto alla spada, and bearing in mind that in Dante's idea all the passions were immedesimate con quest'unica della religione, the interpretation of the poem is strictly dependent on understanding this passione dell'animo, this passion of the soul, which most closely influenced Dante's character and intentions in writing the Commedia. So I think that Foscolo's merit lies in having stated what more than a century later Bruno Nardi would have stated in Dante Profeta in 1941. Chi considera la visione dantesca al rapimento del poeta al cielo come finzioni letterarie travisa il senso. In fact, Foscolo is the first to support Dante's prophetic mission with such efforts, as well as in the comparison with St. Paul's Raptus in the Terzo Cielo. The central junction of the argument takes place in the interpretation of Paradiso 25. If it should happen, if the sacred poem, this work so shared by heaven and by earth, that it has made me lean through these long years, can ever overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair fall where I slept, a lamb opposed to walls that war on it, by then, with other voice, with other fleece, I shall return as poet and put on at my baptismal font the laurel crown. For there I first found entry to that faith which makes souls welcome unto God, and then for that faith Peter garlanded my brow. So, according to Foscolo, however, decisive are the verses of the terzina that follows. So did the apostolic light, at whose command I had replied, while blessing me and singing, then encircled me 3 times. This passage makes it possible to paraphrase more aptly the crown at verse 9 of Paradiso 25. In the exact place where he was baptized and received access to the Catholic faith and doctrine, the Baptistero of San Giovanni, Dante will receive the poet's crown, not distinguished from the Christian's crown, received from St. Peter after hearing his profession of faith and passing his examination. As Foscolo puts it, Dante had no intention of dirlo palesemente, almen per allora, but on the opposite, in Paradiso 24, when he says, then encircle me 3 times, it's very clear that it is held for the right of the imposition of the la consacrazione al ministero apostolico. So, in this case, it is very clear that St. Peter's it's giving to Dante this kind of power, this kind of minister apostolic power without any in general intermediation of the church or any other entities. So now let's go back to the passage that I highlighted before. The quote is placed in the epigraph of the work of the Discorso and is taken from the Divinazione by Cicero, second book, which makes reference to an initiatory situation, a condition that requires silence. Tell me when it seems to you that there is silence. He doesn't waste time either looking up or around. He immediately answers that it seems to him that silence is there. The expert must be one who knows what silence is. In the time of our ancestors, for this function we made use of an expert. Today we take anyone. So the expert indicates the new practices of the auguri and the aruspici compared to those of the past. From the peritus we move on to a more general quilide. This initial reference to silence has recently been interpreted by Chiara Piola Caselli as a request to the reader for a specific and appropriate condition for reading the Commedia. She says, la condizione che consente l'ispirazione profetica perché, come insegna il celebrante del rito di auspicazione al suo assistente, solo nel silenzio si ricevono e si interpretano i segni arcani. Although the interpretation is correct and closely echoes Foscolo's words found within section 46, il testo del suo poema troverebbe commentatori che l'avrebbero concordato con le scritture e avvertito assai cose che eludono gli studi nostri e adorato nel teologo ciò che oggi pare ridicolo nel poeta. Avrebbero udito il silenzio, al quale i critici di ogni poesia primitiva dovrebbero intendere. But still, without a reference to the Protestant influence, particularly the manner in which the meetings of the elite and prosperous London Quaker community were conducted, one cannot fully understand the meanings entrusted by Foscolo to the word silenzio, and the reason for its presence at the beginning of the Discorso. So let's use an example of the description of a meeting offered by John Sykes in the Quakers, A New Look at Their Place in Society. The meeting is grounded in silence, but out of this vocal prayer of words of exhortation or reflection, the exact character of which is not easy to pin, may arise from any person present. The first phase is that of settling down into the quiet of the meeting. Both regular members and attenders are advised to arrive a little early, to have found a place by the appointed hour that ushers in the silence. Then to relax in mind and body, to steady the breathing to an even pace, to link the hands and ankles and incline the head so that nerves and feeling may become tender. In the second phase, many will harness their mind to the repetition of prayer or scripture or some significant holy name, evoking as with a mantra. Now, perhaps someone might speak. The concerted leap forward of the meeting, this is the start of the fourth phase. By now, the worshippers are drawn close, wired up one to another, so that the light dawning in one or two of them diffuses its power through the rest, helping them to the same stage. For it is the group experience the Quakers look for. While waiting upon the Lord in silence, we received often the pouring down of the Spirit. There is no recital of creed, no outward sacrament. The meeting relies only on the silent pressure of the group, feeling towards the light. So the initiatory condition of silence seems to be a necessary requirement for Foscolo for interpreting the text of the Commedia, belonging at the same time to the genre of theological and, I quote, primitive, in the Dickian sense, poetry. The interpretation presented by Foscolo within the Discorso is strongly influenced by Dante's consecration as an apostolic minister, as may be inferred from Paradiso 24, the moment where St. Peter allegedly entrusted him with the mission of founding and presiding over a nuova scuola di religione in Europa, as Foscolo says. In this way, the Florentine poet would have received his mandate directly from God, without ecclesial mediation. In support of this argument, Foscolo also makes reference to the Latin treatise of the Monarchia. The Latin treatise De Monarchia, rendered to broaden the apostolic distinction of faith and law, and applied to restore the rights of Caesar, which the evangelical age had inculcated in Christians. The doctrine was afterwards illustrated by many, useful to all Protestant churches, and nowadays to some Catholics. But Dante was first. That book acts as a political commentary on the poem. So, to conclude, I can say that Foscolo's choice of commenting on Dante's poem, therefore, involves bringing out the prophetic and initiatory message of the Commedia on two levels. The first one presents contiguity with the ideas of Quaker Protestantism. It could only be well accepted in the nonconformist context that protected Foscolo in London. The second one functions as a criticism towards the Catholic Church tool in reinforcing Austrian influence, and in some regions direct rulership within the states of the Italian peninsula. At home, therefore, the figure of Dante, assumed as the father of the future unity of the nation and becoming part of the literary canon of the classics, becomes incisive on the political present. A Foscolo's commentary brings with it precisely this intent. Now that the importance of the nonconformist influence has been maybe proved, still a lot of work remains to be done. There is a great need for a further analysis of the English Protestant text that the author Foscolo might have consulted, and of the relations with the main protagonist of the nonconformist circles frequented by Foscolo in London. so as to succeed in reconstructing integrally the network of relations of Foscolo within the Protestant communities, with particular regard to the political implications of the circle. And that is what I hope to do maybe, I guess, in the next few months or years. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Next speaker is José Gabriel Alegria. José is an artist and an art historian from Peru, currently doing his PhD in Hispanic languages and literature at the Stonybrook University, New York. His research focuses on colonial religious iconography in the Andes and, more broadly, in the comparative study of religions as related to art. Today, José will seek to draw parallels between iconographic and textual traditions that might have influenced Dante's description of a three-faced Lucifer. The title of presentation is Possible Sources for Dante's Lucifer in Canto 34. You can catch it. So thank you. I would just like to add that José is a very talented illustrator. The image of Lucifer here comes from his own hands.
Muchas gracias, Filippo. So, okay, as Filippo just introduced, this work seeks to draw parallels between iconographic and textual traditions that might have influenced Dante's description of Lucifer with three faces in the last canto of the Inferno. And first we will consider the biblical sources that have fostered the most common interpretation of the canto, considering it the sign of an inverted trinity or a theology of the devil, more punctually. This came from the notion of demonic plagiarism that had been introduced by Justin Martyr as early as the 2nd century. The opening Latin verse of the Canto 34, Vexilla regis pro Deum Inferni, being of course a distorted copy or mockery of the Hymn of the Cross by Venantius Fortunatus, would certainly lend itself to such interpretation. Sorry. This is not... okay. So, Dante's Lucifer cries, most importantly. He's, and I quote, weeping and gnashing of teeth, as, end quote, is said by Matthew, that what damnation will be like, according to Matthew, at the end of times, is transformed by Dante. This weeping and gnashing of teeth is generally transformed into the contrapasso, the punishment of the traitors Judas, Cassius, and Brutus, who are therefore being eternally chewed inside Lucifer's mouth. But his 6 wings, interestingly, are a reminder of his former condition as a seraphim, based on Isaiah's description of the highest order of angels. And so seem to be his 6 eyes. Therefore, it's interesting to introduce, I think, this version of a 3-faced seraphim that could have been most likely what Dante drew from to make a 6-winged and 3-faced Lucifer. In this case, a distortion of such an idea of a seraphim. However, I think it's interesting, and the main part of this work would be to point out that there are medieval textual antecedents for a 3-faced devil. Dante is usually pointed out as a basically main source for iconography, but in this case I think there are actually written accounts of devils that precede Dante and where Dante may have drawn this from. François Boesflug, the French historian of art, brought to light the fascinating fact that in the manuscript of the Vita Norberti from the 12th century, written between 1155 to 1164, St. Norbert of Xanten was said to have had a pseudo-vision of the Trinity. A 3-faced Trinity presented herself to him and demanded to be adored as such, to which St. Norbert replied that it was in fact a 3-faced devil in disguise. Boesflug comments that this corresponded to strong millenarist feelings among the newly formed order, which was reflected in the constant apocalyptic fear, and I quote, that the Antichrist will pretend to be amongst God's children, or even pretend to be God himself, end quote. And a very similar incident, but a separate one, was said to have taken place in 1221 and is recorded by the 16th century Flemish theologian Johannes Molanus in his treatise on the history of sacred images from 1594, where this page is from. And now I quote the translation from this. In the year 1221, in the Premonstratensian church, to a certain brother, we don't know the name of that monk, that was meditating of the deepest and ineffable Trinity, that is God, a matinal demon presented himself, and he appeared as having 3 heads, declaring that he was the Trinity, and that by merit of his faith he was worthy of such a vision of the Trinity. But the brother, recognizing the deceit of the enemy, who was trying to persuade him, forced him to go away. End quote. On the light of these sources, I think it is possible to assert that Dante was already drawing from an existing tradition or an exemplar that was already in use by Dante's time. But as Teodolinda Barolini proposed in her 1991 book, theologizing Dante is never enough. And his thinking and contemporary culture were organic and full of both exchanges and conflicts. So we will move towards those exchanges and conflicts in these images. The historian Sarah Lipton, he specialized in Jewish medieval history, has also proposed how some depictions of a 3-faced devil that preceded Dante, in fact, both of them, were closely linked to anti-Semitic stereotypes about usury, a topic about which Dante was also kind of anxious about, and links this to the 12th century South German mystery play Ludus de Antichristo, which was written around 1160. And in this mystery play, the Jews are depicted as the first people to recognize the Antichrist as the Messiah. These are two representations from the 13th century and the 12th century, most likely, that actually, both from the 13th century, sorry, that actually represent a 3-faced devil in connection to usury and the Jews, both. In this case, regarding the Book of Kings and most likely the Apocalypse, where this stereotype was most likely in use. Very problematically, of course. But moving forward to the exchanges of images, on an iconographic level, I would also like to take into consideration the Orientalist hypothesis put forward by the historian Jurgis Baltrusaitis. He proposed that Lucifer's prominent bat wings were in fact a medieval adoption from Chinese painting. As we see, this is an interesting bit from an 11th century Chinese painter. And actually bats, as asserted by Baltrusaitis, were in fact a symbol of good luck in Chinese culture from ancient times that might have been connected, that might have made their way to Europe by exchanges through the Silk Route, and that such Asian motifs traveled through the Silk Route profusely and were assimilated in the West, but for the Christian imaginary of the demonic, as all Eastern was almost immediately demonified. An idea that might also apply, I think, to Lucifer's multicolored faces. This is not something that Baltrusaitis points out, but I think his own theory applies to this case, that the wrathful deities of Vajrayana Buddhism, as the one on the right, are often depicted with 3 faces of 3 different colors, often blue or black, red and yellow or white, which actually coincide perfectly with Dante's descriptions of the 3 faces of Lucifer. But to move directly to the history of this motif, the historian of religion Raffaele Petazzoni proposed that both the iconography for a 3-faced devil and a 3-faced Holy Trinity, so both for God and the devil, may have been derived from ancient steles depicting the Gallic god Lugus that were found in the Pyrenees between the south of France and the north of Spain, a god with Julius Caesar called Mercurio Gallico. This Lugus pattern, as we might call it, is characterized by the fusion of the 3 faces, which actually produces 4 eyes that actually share 3 faces and 3 noses. And actually, this doesn't apply to Dante's description, because Dante mentions specifically that Lucifer cries with 6 eyes. But it's a sort of iconographic shift that is applied to this case. Here we find 2 cases of early manuscripts where it is applied for God and the devil. And the case for God actually makes use of 3 separate faces, but the case for the devil is already making use of the Lugus pattern, which actually makes a fusion of these 3 faces. So here are some other examples where we can see how the pattern is applied, where we have 3 faces separately and also 3 faces merged with each other. We have many variations. In this case, this Divina Commedia at Oxford from the Bodleian Library, in fact, is not depicting Lucifer, but it's depicting Cerberus. And in this case, Cerberus is not even understood as the dog from classical antiquity. It's been completely turned into a three-faced demon. So that's an interesting turn as well. Lastly, this same Divina Commedia has, of course, a Lucifer sharing faces, not very accurate in that regard, but that's quite interesting because the god in this same manuscript also has three faces in the same configuration, so they actually work as a sort of distorting mirror of each other, one could say. And the last example actually doesn't follow Dante at all, doesn't really care, is the one in the Morgan Library where Lucifer almost seems to have three separate heads, fully separate heads. As such, the correspondence between the text and image had never been consistent in the early manuscripts of the Commedia, and that is what ultimately constituted its richness and complexity, in my opinion at least. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jose. Now let's move on to our third speaker, Megan Loreto. Megan is a second-year master student in the English and American Literature department. Her work largely focuses on application of eco-criticism, post-colonialism, and spatial studies to a range of literary texts. Her essay offers an eco-critical exploration of how Dante's Inferno uses Ovid's Metamorphosis to characterize the relationship between nature and humans, as it mediated through an evolving understanding of the divine. The title of her presentation is Dante and Ovid, Forests of Divine. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. Years of scholarship have solidified many arguments in favor of reading Dante, which comprehend the vastly intertextual nature of his work. Among other works, one of the key texts woven into Dante's project is Ovid's Metamorphosis. The significance of Ovid as a writer and character in the Divine Comedy has likewise been probed by many years of scholarship. There are many reasons why Dante may have chosen to include references, explicit and implicit, to Ovid. Chief among them is an exception of his late medieval readers' familiarity with the Metamorphosis and the classical mythology of Greek and Rome. Yet this deployment of pagan myth creates an intriguing paradox for a text which is so overtly Christian. In scholarship, this paradox, the tension between Dante's use of the pagan to illustrate and reinforce his readers' understanding of the Christian, is essential. In the Poetry of Illusion, Virgil and Ovid in Dante's Commedia, by Jeffrey Schnapp and Rachel Jacob, they write, quote, "Perhaps more than any other medieval writer, Dante gives the impression of responding to the nuances, complexities, and historical specificity of his classical source texts. In so doing, he forces his reader to revisit these texts as well, with a paradoxical effect. The appropriator and adapter, it also summons us to attend to that which in Virgil and Ovid eludes, resists, and challenges Dante's Christian vision. Rather than evading that which Dante believes is most compelling from the past and the pagan, he utilizes their power for the construction of a version of Christian Aristotelian morality which operates throughout Inferno and the larger Divine Comedy. In the Poetry of Illusion and other works exploring Ovid, Paradiso seems to be of particular interest to scholars. However, this research will focus specifically on Inferno. In focusing on this canticle, I hope to center on the particular function of Dante's adoption of Ovidian myth and metamorphosis as a single point in the constellation of the larger project of the Divine Comedy. Metamorphosis as both an exterior and interior process is an essential function of human life. Humans are mutable. They have the ability to change, adapt, and become someone or something new in response to their environment. These are defining characteristics of the human condition. Why, then, does metamorphosis also define the circles of Dante's underworld and afterlife? In particular, I seek to explore the mediation between nature and human beings through the divine. In Dante, this mediation occurs as punishment for transgressions of nature or God, though they are generally one and the same, in death. In Ovid, the gods mediate both punishment and reward for piety through nature in life. Another case for eco-criticism. Studying the two texts through their portrayal of nature is an effort largely motivated from the era from which I'm writing. As the 21st century reader encounters Dante's text, it is in many ways impossible not to draw connections between the pollution of Dante's Inferno and the environmental crisis of the Anthropocene. Even in returning to Ovid's Metamorphoses, there seems to be a prophetic quality for the 21st century reader. It is impossible not to identify something of the contemporary everyday in both texts as they condemn human beings when they disregard, plunder, or underestimate nature. Our existing preconceptions of nature, the natural world, the non-human, non-anthropocentric part of the world, are more than necessary for us to consider and confront. Though written prior to what we denote as the Anthropocene, Dante's consideration of science, philosophy, the natural world, as well as economic systems and human excess are deeply relevant to ongoing conversations as we confront a more vivid ecological crisis. Of course, while neither text offers a scientific explanation of over-extraction, deforestation, or carbon emission, they depict human centrism, greed at the expense of the earth, and imbalance. Further, they offer immediate retribution for these actions against nature, considered to be, in both cases, an extension of the divine. I'm interested in the way this mythological pagan notion of punishment for plundering nature or disrespecting the earth and the Christian Aristotelian morality Dante explores combine together in Dante and build a complex approach to contrapposto in Inferno. Further, I am interested in the way Dante's particular characterization of the relationship between nature and humans, mediated through the divine, continues to form or influence human beings' perceptions of nature in the contemporary landscape of eco-criticism. While eco-criticism tends to focus on texts written during the age of Anthropocene, how do medieval and classical literature influence our contemporary understanding of nature as well as our transgressions against it? In what ways might Dante's Inferno contribute to the formation by utilizing Ovid's mythology? There is a need to revisit the works of Dante and Ovid to better develop a lens for contemporary eco-criticism that can account for the past. That is not to say one has only to factor in historical interactions between humans and nature as it is recorded by literature through the ages. Rather, it is a means to examine the affective relationship between humans and nature that is inherited through the literature of the past as we revisit it in the present. That is not to say that literature written prior to the Anthropocene should be considered through the morality of the present. It is instead to advocate for a deep consideration of the way the past influences and impacts the morality of our current and future understanding and relationships to nature. This method ought to be both attentive to the past and its existing scholarship and progressive, as it imagines a way to both evaluate the past and reincorporate inexhaustible works that may otherwise be deemed less pressing in the face of an ecological crisis. In the article Italian Eco-Poetry or the Art of Reading Through Negativity, Daniela Canamella discusses the importance of returning to the tradition of Italian poetry. In addition to depicting a full and relatively comprehensive understanding of the contemporary landscape of eco-criticism and eco-poetry, Canamella synthesizes a compelling argument for the necessity of recognizing the important role of nature and the pastoral in the tradition of Italian poetry. She writes, quote, "In examining how a seemingly obsolete pastoral beauty is both indicative of an Italian philology of nature, but also surprisingly reflective of our environmental present, my investigation engages the notion of negativity in its many iterations: lack, loss, desire, frustration, concealment, criticism. This study uses negativity as a method of inquiry, as a criterion for selecting an archive of poetry that is still at the margins of the ecological canon, and as the negative affects underlying these works," end quote. The notion of negativity in relationship to nature in Italian poetry, as Canamella argues, can easily be conflated as a 21st century concern of explicitly eco-critical work. However, predating the 21st century and predating the Anthropocene, the relationship between negativity and nature is part of the tradition of Italian poetry itself. Directly citing one example from Ovid, Canamella utilizes the story of Proserpine as an example of the cycle of loss and desire, negativity, which culminates in spring, that is to say, nature. In Dante, if in life souls have sinned by clinging to materiality, partaking in excess, transgressing the laws of nature, they are punished by returning to a state of speechless animality, becoming a bleeding tree, or drowning in the earth itself. The earth itself also finds itself positioned in direct opposition to the heavens. Its own materiality, its dirt and earth, is synonymous with time, death, and loss. Canamella concludes, the surprisingly classic humanism of Italian eco-poetry celebrates the challenge of being bodies interlocking with bodies and reevaluates negative affects, death, illness, displacement as a way to rethink human nature and our sense of place. Here the author complicates the idea of a human-centric approach to the environment in classical and traditional Italian poetry and presents an opportunity to return to such texts by offering them as a source of an echo which continues to resound in the poetry of our own era. The focus on negativity and on death as being related to nature strikes me as a particularly strong link between our consideration of nature in the age of Anthropocene, Dante's depiction of Inferno, and Ovid's nature. The main element missing in Canamella's work is the particular consideration of the role of the divine in this chain of works. Beginning with Ovid's Metamorphosis, the compelling contours of his work begin with the liminality of humans and earth. As he introduces the origin story of human beings, the very fine line between divine, human, and nature are crossed and stitched together. In the striking article, Plants' Interconnected Lives, From Ovid's Myths to Pre-Socratic Thought and Beyond by Claudia Zada, she writes, quote, in Ovid's metamorphic world, form carries meaning, and our poet is very skillful in conjuring up physical change as a process that, occurring via formal analogies, affects also a transfer of qualities. Fully comprehended, metamorphosis results in a striking preservative event. So for instance, the origin from stones explains the character of a new race of humans that came into being after the deluge. Human beings possess indeed the same harshness of stone and are thereby predisposed to endure toil and to last. In the transformation from one body to the other, such traits remain, and the characteristic of inanimate beings becomes that of a living one, end quote. Zada captures the importance of Ovid's form of metamorphosis, at least in its earliest depiction in the text. That the metamorphosis is a preservative event and that traits remain from the original form are striking and necessary revelations for metamorphosis, both of which change in Dante's way of metamorphosizing. Many times the very contrapasso of Dante's Inferno is the oppositeness of the characteristics that sinners are forced to take on through transformation, rather than the characteristics shared between new form and their previous one. Ovid's process of metamorphosis suggests a thinner line between earth and human, and perhaps a sense of divinity that is more imbued in nature and closer to it. This distinction between pagan gods and the Christian God is not revelatory, but it is interesting to consider Dante's active choice to adopt a process of the power of divine transformation when it implies the closeness of God and the very materiality which opposes heaven. Perhaps it is Dante's humanism, rather, which compels him to use Ovid's inheritance. In conclusion, in the 21st century, as we encounter pre-Anthropocene literature and look for reflections of ourselves in the text, we are also searching for a deeper sense of the universal experience of life. With increasing frequency, that means a deeper sense of the universal beyond just the human. We continue to search for a deeper understanding of the environment through canonical text that have historically built our collective understanding of the relative relationship between nature, such as plants and trees and human beings. In these texts, that relationship is illustrated as being mediated by the power of divinity, yet the role of the author, historian, and philosopher are, in fact, the real forces acting upon Dante and Ovid's depictions of the relationship between man and nature. The gods and God are the fictional manifestations of the historical sense of morality, which both cultivated and justified human behavior over the span of centuries, and likely continue to influence our contemporary relationship to nature. By revisiting these texts, we find a tension which pulls between Dante's construction of a new morality and his inability to display the desire for a complete divorce from the old world, its mythology, its art, and its culture. This is a visible tension for both Dante the narrator and Dante the author, and indeed ourselves. The implicit and underlying structures of our old worlds, for there are many, continue to prop up, hinder, and veil our attempts to both recognize and reimagine our relationship to the natural world. Only by revisiting the past and understanding how the transformations between new and old take place in literature and in our collective consciousness can we begin to understand how to reconstruct our minds for the Anthropocene and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Next up, we have our last speaker for this session, Katherine Madsen. Kate is a second-year MA student in English and American literature. Her research focuses primarily on the postmodern novel, media theory, and eco-criticism. Her presentation employs the eco-critical technique of reading for water to broaden and deepen our understanding of Dante's Inferno. The title of her presentation is Water e contrappasso in Dante's Inferno. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Filippo. So how this presentation is going to go is I'm going to give an introduction to reading for water, and then I'll read Canto VII of the Inferno for water, and then I'll have some concluding remarks. When we speak about poetry, our language suddenly floods with water. Readers talk of a verse's flow and rhythm calling up a river's pulse, the push and pull of waves, water crashing on the shore. We describe work as shallow or deep. The greater the pressure of water upon it, the more significant the work. Writers of water like Virginia Woolf have conceptualized water through its nascent narrative capacity, offering the model for Woolf's famed stream of consciousness narration on display into The Lighthouse and The Waves. In Moby Dick, Herman Melville constructs water as the medium of imperial pursuit of capital, the site at which man colonizes nature. But when a reader usually thinks of water, she calls to mind its capacity to cleanse, calm, and regenerate. Water is usually a balm that soothes ills and nourishes growth. Dante, instead, co-opts these capacities to accomplish the opposite. He does not allow water to abate his character's pain, but rather muddies the waters, proverbially and literally, to rob water of its nourishing essence. He renews the violence inherent in water. In academic literature about Dante, scholars are often most concerned with the icy pit of hell and the cleansing waters of purgatory. Rowan Williams suggests that in Purgatorio, water prepares one to move from purgatory to heaven as a, quote, recapitulation of the reality that baptism affects, end quote. He argues that, quote, but for all the ferocity of the wind in hell, its function is not to move, but to freeze. It blows in order to prevent motion, to turn flowing water to ice, and to fix the damned in glassy immobility, end quote. But Williams focuses too much on water's final stage rather than its role throughout Inferno. To him, the frigid stillness of frozen water mirrors how sin impedes the steady flow of language. As we will see, wind as a component of hell's weather takes on a more complicated role. And when other scholars discuss water in Dante, they fixate instead on how he conceptualizes weather, through the lens of Aristotle's philosophies, or how he fits with the theories of his contemporaries. Instead, I am most interested in taking an eco-critical approach to Dante's work because rather than the baptismal haven of purgatory's flowing waters, or the stillness of hell's frigid pit, the rivers and rains in hell brutalize. By studying Dante's watery contrappasso, we can uncover Dante's shifting priorities as water cycles through its solid, liquid, and gaseous forms. I will employ Isabel Hoffmeyer, Sarah Nuttall, and Sharon Levery's strategy of reading for water laid out in their 2022 article of the same name to parse untold meanings in Dante's work. This task will require going below the waterline to understand water not just as a totem of Christianity, but a multitudinous body and idea that deserves to be understood in all its complexity. Catharsis and purification are some of the Commedia's central themes, and what water accomplishes through baptism mirrors what Dante wants the Commedia to do for readers. He wants them to descend into hell so that they can eventually cast off their sins and be born anew. Water is critical to Dante's purpose. And for contemporary readers, Dante's depiction of water is like a premonition. Acid rain falls to burn our skin, and dirty water irrigates barren land. Fittingly, he emphasizes these morbid realities in a circle of gluttons. We must study water's primacy in Inferno to buoy a more generative understanding of the text. Perhaps we can even employ Dante's theory to see how we respond to crimes against the climate today. Canto VII sees Dante and Virgil descend into the fourth circle of hell, where sinners are punished for avarice and prodigality. Dante chastises these sinners for their overconsumption of earthly materials rather than restraining themselves in favor of the lights one can earn after death. Quote, now you see, my son, what brief mockery fortune makes of goods we trust her with, for which the race of men embroil themselves, end quote. The sins of avarice and prodigality value the material world too highly, placing transient earthly possession above God's divine will. These sinners trust fortune over God. Dante thus constructs the topography of this circle around water, linking overconsumption with watery punishment. And here are a few lines from the seventh canto. We cross the circle to the other bank beside a spring that bubbles up and flows into a channel it makes for itself. The water was darker than the deepest purple. Accompanied by its murky waves, we began our strange descent. This dreary stream, once it had reached these malignant ashen slopes, drains out to a swamp called Styx. Dante affords the river agency in forging its path rather than pointing to a creator who carved its track. But the bubbling spring does not produce fresh water. Rather, Dante and Virgil see a stream of liquid so corrupted it is difficult to distinguish as water. This liquid cannot cleanse, only pollute. And Styx is not a river, but a stagnant marsh. The disgusting water stands in its own filth, the better to torture sinners. And then a few more lines from Canto 7. And I, my gaze transfixed, could see people with angry faces in that bog, naked, their bodies smeared with mud. They struck each other with their hands, their heads, their chests and feet. They tore each other with their teeth. The good master said, Son, now you see the souls of those whom anger overcame. And I would have you know for certain that plunged beneath these waters, as your eyes will tell you, are souls whose sighs with bubbles make the water's surface seethe. This passage begins with Dante bewitched by sinners dwelling in the muck. Virgil explains that these shades on earth were both slothful and angry. Bubbles break the water from the sinner's exhalations. Death does not save shades from drowning without oxygen. Hollander calls Styx the muddy river of fleshy sins, connecting water with materiality. But the river's liquid resembles water without seeming to possess its typical properties of cleanliness and freshness. Virgil describes the sinner's vegetal language, the dirty water acting as a womb's amniotic fluid and reverting the sinners back to a pre-linguistic state. We hear this as a, quote, hymn they gurgle in their gullets, for they cannot get a word out whole, end quote. The torturous swallowing mud calls to mind Cerberus's fate, and their contrapasso is being stuck in mucky water that slows their movements unwillingly, similar to their slothful ways in life. However, their earthly sins are reenacted in the water's depths. Dante employs water here to turn the natural airy medium deadly. The weight and force of water can both restrain movements and control them to the point of drowning. And he saturates water, a life-giving quality, with materiality. This river is slime and black mire, far from any ability to cleanse or nourish. In our time, we can use Dante's punishment for those obsessed with wealth to think about punishment for capitalist accumulation. Mudslides ravage homes and the sea drowns coastlines, but nature does not dole out its contrapasso towards those individuals responsible. Instead, it apportions punishment to humanity as a whole, though most often targeting those least responsible. Perhaps Dante's theories to make sense for today's crimes against nature require a socialist, class-conscious revision. Because it is not individuals who should carry the onus of environmental degradation, at least individuals outside of the 1%, maybe corporations and governments should suffer for refusing to check their undue extraction and accumulation. We can read the sinner's bitter anger as a consequence of obsession with materiality at the expense of God and the environment. In conclusion, reading Dante for water opens up new ways of understanding his intentions with Inferno. And rather than relying solely on biblical allusion or references to ancient philosophy like many scholars do, water helps us expand the media's meaning to fit our own times. Even 700 years ago, Dante understood the climate's centrality in our lives. And because catharsis and purification are some of Inferno's central themes, the rite of baptism is vital to the arc of the story. Water is the means through which one is purified, or that which ensures one remains corrupted. We would be wise to apply Dante's morals to our dealings with the climate today to avoid hell-like retribution for our sins against nature. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm really happy to present the next speaker, Fabio. Fabio Caridas is finishing a master in the Ecole Normale Supérieure, where he worked on the question of survival, following the model of A.B. Warburg's work on the Quattrocento. He's a prospective PhD student in the Italian department here at NYU starting fall 2023, with a doctoral project that focuses on Dante's Inferno and its relation to early 20th century modernist theories. So about his presentation, as he will be analyzing the modernity of desire present in the Commedia, he will focus on the purely alienating character of hell. He will do that starting from the so-called sensitive theory of modernity by Benjamin, Simmel and Krakauer, that tried to show how mutations of the urban environment had radically transformed the condition of sensitive experience of the modern man. Please, Fabio.
So, thank you. Yes, so first of all, I just arrived here, like yesterday, and I really wanted to be here to present this and to be with all of the people in the class, because it was a moment that totally changed my life forever. And I was doing my things in Paris, and then I decided to stay in New York and to apply for a PhD to continue to study Dante. So it's beautiful to be here, etc. But the terrible thing is that I had 30 pages, but I had to reduce it because Filippo told me that we have only 10 minutes. So I don't know if you will understand everything, but because everything is worked as mathematic thing, so everything has to be shaped together. But I will try. I have only 5 pages, so we will see. So I want to make a link between the sensitive theory of modernity, which is not really a real theory. It's just because Simmel was the professor of Krakauer and Benjamin in Berlin in the early 20th century. So it is theories that I put together to create something that we can call sensitive, because it's a sensitive look of modernity, how modernity and the new metropolis has influenced and totally changed the city dweller. And I want to link it with the sinners in Dante's Inferno. So I have many things to say, but I will just focus on the question of time for this presentation. So Simmel, Krakauer, and Benjamin brought a new perspective to the rise of modern era, focusing on the behaviors of the inhabitants of metropolis at the beginning of the 20th century. By looking at the movement of the crowd, the development of mass entertainments, and by analyzing the receptivity to the traumatic shocks of the metropolis by the city dweller, they have tried to show that the mutation of the environment had radically transformed the conditions of the sensitive experience and through it modified the human sensory apparatus. The whole of the writing on modernity consists of disjointed fragments written over than more 50 years, which took the form of philosophical writings, conference, film review, and essay that my study will propose together. In order to establish a link between the condition of modern man described in this theory and that of the sinners in Dante's Inferno, I will focus on the initial injunctive desire of divine justice in Canto III that allows the sinner to cross Acheron River and intrinsically, sorry for my English, changing the subjective interiority. So we have this verse in Canto III, and they are eager to cross the river, for the justice of God so spurs them on the very fear is turned into longing. Now this metamorphosis is extremely intriguing, since it establishes the state of desire as primordial to reach hell. But how can the fear of the fate that awaits him in hell transform the sinner into a being of desire? We find in this verse that it is divine justice which presses them and which operates this transformation. According to the different commentaries of La Commedia, we find a confrontation of a theological explanation that aims to justify the power and the necessity of the divine justice in an external dynamic that goes from God to the sinner, with another type of theories that focus on the interiority of the sinners and aim to explain the subjective relation of the sinners with the primary desire, a desire that can be seen as an essence of inner vice that would then be revelated at the moment of crossing the river. However, I do not think that the desire that the sinners experience at the moment of the passage to hell correspond to the revelation of an internal essence or an act of fetishism. On the contrary, I think that Dante introduces the notion of interdependence of the internal character of the desire of the sinner with the external character of the injunction. The transformation of the interiority of the sinners by an impure and sufflated desire by the external element, which is a divine justice, make the punishment of the sinners in hell possible, both physically, the possibility of the passage to the other side, and conceptually, as we shall see, desire can be understood as an essential condition in hell. On this passage, Dante was inspired by Book 6 of the Aeneid, in which Aeneas crosses Acheron River. The sinners also have the desire to cross the river and reach the other side, but for a very, very different reason. It is very important. In fact, Virgil compares the sinners with autumnal leaves and migratory birds in two different metaphors that seem to underline the same movement. I will read it to you. As many as the leaves that fall in the wood as the first frost of autumn, as many as the bird that flocks the land from ocean deeps, when the cold of the year drives them abroad and dispatches them to sunnier countries. So that was the passage of the Aeneid. Dante repeats Virgil's first metaphor about autumn leaves, but subtly changes that of the birds. He thus transforms Virgil's migratory birds, which suggest a cyclical, seasonal pattern of departure, into birds of prey responding to the injunctive call of the falconer. At those a falcon as it summons. That was a Dante verse. The desire of Dante's sinners to rush to eternal atonement is then counterintuitive. Oh, but that's okay. It's better. Like this, you focus. So indeed, according to Rilke elegies, now I want to talk a bit about Rilke elegies. Migratory birds act knowingly as well as living, unaffected by the universe in which they find themselves in the inner self. In the fourth elegy, Rilke writes, "We are not aware, turned like the migratory birds." So migratory birds in Rilke's fourth elegy correspond to the previous model of the Greek hero seen by James in his book The Origin of Consciousness, in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, a being that is not crossed by doubt, by thought, the sheath, the conscience. For the Greek hero, to live is not dissociable from the fact of knowing that he must do and of doing it. The modern man, according to Rilke, does not manage as a migratory bird and therefore as the Greek hero to find a coherence between his being and his way of living. In other words, he cannot regulate himself. He is crossed and broken by the thought, and he discovers between wither and bloom. Indeed, Lucas describes in the theory of the novel the world of the epic as experienced as homogeneous, a totally of which the hero is part, while in the novel, the modern novel, the world is experienced as fragmentary and with respect to subjectivity, radically other. So that is more like Dante passage. In the sixth elegy, Rilke exposes the fact that modern man goes against nature, while the Greek hero, similar to migratory birds, share an indestructible bond with nature. He says something that I think it's beautiful. He says, only heroes who throw themselves forward, preceding their own smile, so may have experienced something approaching the nature of a true thing. Desire is trigger and disrupted of the natural bond with animals. It is beginning of the condition of modern man, as it is the beginning of the path of the sinner to hell. Now I am getting into Krakauer theory. So for Krakauer, modern age had broken forever man's relationship with sensation, with his body, with touch and spirituality. The modern world represents, according to Krakauer, a world henceforth without link with the transcendence, reduced to its material existence. There is no more place for the tragic, for the soul, for the promise of reconciliation. He then analyzed the emergence of mass entertainment, which act as a response to the modern need for stimuli, acting as compensatory for the impoverished experience of modern life. This leaves room for two things, really important, but I will not have time to explain them. So it is the life of modern man is governed by immateriality, and modern man experiences a progressive loss of language. These two elements represent two of the most important contrapasso of hell. Moreover, Simmel, in his essay on the sociology of the senses, speak about the fact that the metropolis, by constantly soliciting the senses of the city dweller, operates a regression in the order of the perception, which could be compared to the blind world, as Virgil calls in hell in Canto IV. So now I will focus my research on the time. It's a brand new thing that I wrote. So in a 1932 essay called Repetitions, Krakauer notes that Berlin makes a point of embodying the present. The existence resembles a juxtaposition of points. We thus have this dialectic between the lived experience and the present moment. But the present described by Krakauer is deformed and as if emptied of its substance because it is not longer put in relation with past or future. Time, in Aristotle's books 4 of his Physics, has 3 dimensions, past, present, and future. Or the crucial dimension is the present because it rules the other dimensions of time. But if the present is no longer this binding element of time, then we enter into an emptiness similar to an eternity without precise time. Now, in Canto X, Dante makes Cavalcante appear and say to him, "We see, like those with faulty vision, things at a distance. That much for us, the mighty ruler, light still shine. When things draw near or happen now, our mind are useless," which means that the sinners have lost the notion of present. But if they are deprived of present, where are they? They live then in an eternity without notion of time, but in the future, when the judgment will arrive, they will not have any kind of knowledge. But if these sinners have no more knowledge, so if they have no more access to the intellectual soul, and they do not possess anymore what Aristotle called in De Anima the nutritive soul and the sensitive soul that dies with the body, then Dante is predisposing the transcendental aesthetic that Kant introduced in the first part of the Critique of Pure Reason, namely the two forms a priori that reside in man, space and time. Deleuze, in his second course on Kant at the University of Paris-Vincennes, takes up the sentence of Shakespeare in Hamlet, beautiful sentence, "The time is out of joint," to illustrate this discovery of Kant. Thus time, which has become subjective, no longer belongs to the world, but is locked up inside man. It is then a prison in Dante's work which makes me think of the new labyrinth invented by Borges in Death and the Compass. Indeed, Borges talks about the transformation of the modern experience in relation to antiquity by inventing a new labyrinth. He says, "I dreamed of a labyrinth that the Greek had not yet invented, a labyrinth that was no longer circular, but in a straight line. This labyrinth is a new labyrinth in which modern man finds himself, but it is exactly the one in which the sinners are. This labyrinth is fundamental for me to understand the idea developed by Proust in À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs, when the narrator hears by chance a name that he had heard for the first time a few months earlier pronounced by Gilbert, whom he not longer see. Then he grabs with violence all the atmosphere in which he was when he was in love with Gilbert. Now this name, an insignificant detail, had been forgotten because it was insignificant, and had then kept in him all the strength of the memory which one remembers intellectually, are truncate memory, abuse, which are only the synthesis of diverse sensations, and which create hybrid superficial beings. The memory of the world, therefore, that of the deepest and true sensation, has been preserved by oblivion. Now, in modern existence, in this labyrinth in straight line, the present constitutes a succession of superficial facts that do not allow forgetting. Thus, I arrive on what Benjamin developed in Sur quelques thèmes baudelairiens in 1939, the lived experience characterized by the communication of punctual contents dedicated to the infinite game of the substitution is the cause of the disappearance of the transmissible experience common to several generations. According to him, this disappearance is correlative to that of the tale, a traditional mode of narration, which sees itself competing with this regime of communication properly metropolitan that are the press and the radio. Founded on a Cybernetic model, the communication of the message has no durability here, contrary to the story which keep its force gathered in him and offer for a long time still matter to the development. The information has value only if the instant when it is new. It lives only in the instant. It must abandon itself entirely to it and open itself to it without losing time. The news refers precisely to the initial shock of information read or heard for the first time. So I think it's very important to look at this study to understand both modern society and its link with the ancient society, of which we have lost forever the exact keys of understanding. This study is therefore a way to reconstitute certain keys as well as to study survivance of culture in one another. The transformation of sensitive apparatus of the modern man is be brought closer to the perception of Dante of the inner contrabass of the sinner. We can thus understand the conditioning of modern man by studying deeply what leads the sinners to the contrabasso, and then brings the research to a crossing between literature and sociology. Modern men who have operate an almost total suicide of his body by living only in the immateriality of his desire goes against the concept of Aristotle according to which man can overcome the weight of materiality by making his body becoming a tool. Modern man falls into materiality by annihilating his body and intellect and all the sensations that were proper to it. Now the forest is in hell is closer to the world of modern man, in the image of the modern society which operates its suicide. This forest is made of immaterial voices. When Dante wants to hear Pierre de Levigne, which is a tree in Canto XIII, Virgil suggests to break one of his branches of this tree. The sinner expresses himself through the blood and the wind that come out of the broken branch. Thus, the modern man also expresses himself, passing, according to Walter Benjamin, by the immateriality, by the radio waves. The modern man lives in the immaterial Silva, where the only mean of expression is by the wind and by the movement of the most infinite particles, almost immaterial as well.
Thank you, Fabio. So let me just prepare the next presentation here. Just a few seconds. Okay. Okay, our next speaker is Dax Johnson. Dax is a poet and a student in NYU's XC program. His work centers on the intertwining of classical mythology and poetry. Now, by discussing the cross-cultural religious antecedents of the figure that is the underworld judge, Minos in Hell and Hades, Dax's presentation seeks to account for its portrayal in Inferno. Please welcome Dax.
Hello. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm very aware that when in the process of writing this essay, I was torn between two different ideas. One of them was just being caught and very interested with this character that that Dante makes of Minos and the antecedents for that character, as was mentioned in my introduction. And the other is figuring out how that sort of actually ties into Dante's larger worldview. So in this process of being of two minds, I kind of have to account for some things given the fact that I only have 10 minutes. So given that I'm sure that all of you have heard many interpretations of our lovely Florentine and of how Minos works exclusively within the context of the Inferno, I'm going to attempt to give a little bit more limelight and time to these cross-cultural antecedents that I've mentioned previously. So with no further ado, I will start. The times listed here are basically everything I was sort of pulling from. In looking for information and sources to pull from when writing this essay, I found a few scholars who discussed the connections between the character of Minos and the character of Osiris, hence the basal myth of death and kingship in Osiris being listed here as the first state. The second that I noticed myself in reading the Inferno was the connection that Dante shared with Gilgamesh, which I'll discuss later on. Of course, there's Gilgamesh proper. There's the Odyssey and the Iliad, where Minos first shows up in Greco-Roman life. Plato, who mentions him in the places where he is mentioned. Diodorus Siculus' Library of History, the Aeneid, Parallel Lives, the Commedia, obviously, and then the reintroductions of Babylon and Egypt into the spirit of Western thought. But with no further ado, in this piece, I intend to examine the changes that Dante has made to the form and characterization of Minos, as contrasted, compared, and developed with and from earlier mythological examples in the Greek tradition, and also provide further background upon the concept of the former king turned judge of the underworld. The case of Minos, for the special relevance he was given by the poets Homer and Hesiod, which continued on throughout Plato and Virgil, among others, looks revelatory as a topic of exploration into Dante's deeper interactions and repurposing, or even refitting, of ancient mythologies. To this point, I will analyze four main concerns involving Dante's transformation of Minos, and what exactly it is that his transformations show in a larger mythological context. The first concern involves the pre-Minos figures of Egyptian and Babylonian mythology, who, even while remaining cognizant of the fact that Dante could not have known of their existence properly, provide helpful exposition upon the territory that Dante, even unknowingly, was treading. Here, I'd like to underscore a certain point that I think cannot be underscored enough. And it's that even if there are certain trends in mythology that, let's say, are not maintained linearly, that is to say, like the school of thought is not kept over a continuously unbroken period of years, there are certain images that appear and reappear in the human mind as associated with certain figures and certain kinds of figures. The second feature is the most direct connection that Dante would have known, being his interactions with the classical mythologies of Greece and Rome. The third is, likewise, the specifics of Dante's portrayal of Minos. Lastly, jumping off from the unique position that Minos holds is an exploration of what his placement signals for some of Dante's treatments of mythology. A scholar by the name of N. Marinatos proposes, to begin chronologically, that Minos corresponds to Osiris. Through the mutual positions of kingship that led to a death by water, Minos boiled alive, and the Osiris thrown into the water inside a chest with boiling lead upon it. Here, I present to you an image of a 22nd dynasty bust with Horus and Isis next to a bust of Osiris, obviously after he died. This death of Osiris was followed by a position of kingship over the dead, according to Marinatos' The So-Called Hell and Sinners in the Odyssey and Homeric Cosmology. This argument is further established within the context of comparing the Greek and Egyptian underworlds on the bases of architecture and personage, the most notable similarity drawn between them being the quote-unquote succession of scenes with the judge coming first and sinners and the blessed appearing subsequently. which, as he notes, is one that is mirrored in the Odyssey. Exactly as Osiris greets the damned first before the blessed, so too does Odysseus first look towards Minos. Of course, it is also worthy of note that this same pattern is as well mirrored within the Inferno. Dante's path throughout the architecture of hell begins with his confrontation of Minos, which sends him throughout the various layers of hell before he reaches the end and begins to climb upwards, initiating a path towards the blessed. When it comes to matters of iconography, it is also incredibly prudent to note the similarities shared between depictions of Minos and Osiris, as well as their associated animals. The two are often shown holding staffs and scepters, even in the underworld, and while the connections that Minos has to the bovine are obvious, it is indeed also the case that Osiris is linked to many mythological bull figures, such as the Apis bull, as an example. Just as Minos is the father of the Minotaur, so too is Osiris the father of this aforementioned bull. The story presented relates the death of Osiris and the present similarities to Minos. The poem centers on both the retention and increase of power and status among the deceased. The story and poem presented being this death of Osiris section that I hope you could read, because I didn't know how it was going to look on a screen this big, and the poem right here, which is obviously much larger. Onto the matter of the similarities that Minos shares with Gilgamesh, the preeminent areas of focus are again their mutual reigns over the living and the dead. The death of Gilgamesh, notably also titled The Great Wild Bull is Lying Down, another reference to a shared connection with the bovine, makes a point to mention the quote-unquote orders and rituals that Gilgamesh carried out, as well as his power after death to quote-unquote pass judgments as weighty as the words of Ningishzida or Dumuzid. Both kings are also demigods, unlike Osiris, and are sired by bovine figures, the mother of Gilgamesh being Ninsun, whose name translates to Lady Wild Cow, and of course Minos being a product of the rape of Europa by Zeus in the form of a bull. Both deities also traditionally conduct their judging in a triumvirate of figures, in place of a sole decision-making figure, as is the case with Osiris. Here, of course, I will also mention the distinctions, just for clarity's sake, or for posterity's sake, between the figures that Minos judges with and the ones that Gilgamesh judges with. Of course, Minos judges with Rhadamanthus and Aeacus, who were mortals in life, and Gilgamesh instead judges with Dumuzid, who is also known by the name of Tammuz, who you may know as being associated with the Greek figure of Adonis, who in Mesopotamia is considered to be more of a deity, and of course he judges alongside Ningishzida, who is also traditionally a deity. So there's some distinction there, but of course I thought it was worth noting as a connection, even with that being the case. To continue moving forward through time, Homer has this to say about Minos within the context of the underworld. Then I saw Minos, son of Jove, with his golden scepter in his hand, sitting in judgment on the dead, and the ghosts were gathered, sitting and standing round him in the spacious house of Hades, to learn his sentences upon them. Homer's description of him, through Odysseus, further enhances the parallel lines drawn between the images created by the prior figures and the character of Minos, and this is only accentuated by Plato's treatment of the figure of Minos in his titular dialogue. Homer, to any other hero except... Oh, let me make sure that's correct. Yes. Homer, to any other hero except Minos, this is amazing praise. And in the raising of the dead spirits in the Odyssey, he has portrayed Minos, not Rhadamanthus, holding the golden scepter and judging. He hasn't portrayed Rhadamanthus judging these, and he has nowhere portrayed him getting together with Zeus. It's because of these things that I assert that Minos was eulogized more than all others by Homer. For to be the child of Zeus, the only one to have been educated by Zeus, is praise that cannot be surpassed. What is established by both Homer and Plato here is the primacy of Minos within the context of arbitration, a precursor to the Minos of Dante's utilization, who judges solely. To speak more of what Homer reveals, though he does not provide further indication as to the appearance of Minos beyond the raiment that he is endowed with, he does initiate a singularity of existence in his position. The golden scepter is a notable object within this larger Greek tradition, and of course possesses much of the same connotations today, those of ruling, of power, and of judgment. Zeus possesses one, as does Agamemnon, and even in this section of the underworld, Tiresias does also. The inclusion of it here likely relates back to all three, though his physical form, as said, not elaborated upon, his carrying of the scepter that Zeus wields is symbolic of the aforementioned fact that Zeus is the one who has granted him legal power in any sense. His law-giving, in life derived from his birth as the son of Zeus, and his station in death from both his status as Zeus's son and the sense of justice he gained from such. Agamemnon carrying one in life further adds to this notion of kingship, and Minos carrying one in the underworld where Agamemnon does not further adds to his esteem in contrast. And Minos seemingly being more tangible by way of holding his scepter, whereas Agamemnon is stated to be substanceless, again adds to this. Tiresias also holding one, while not being a judge of the dead, continues this notion. Through the downplaying of, or of the failure to acknowledge the existence of Rhadamanthus and Aeacus, we can glean some insight into the nature of Dante's singling out of his personage, most notably so in Plato's inclusion of the line, in this translation, only one to have been educated by Zeus. This is again a central and establishing aspect for the character of Minos as relates to the figure of Zeus and the general concept of divine judgment. But I think the time is running down for me, so I'll leave you on the notion that Minos is significant and significant enough to, well, bring up these prior historical figures of great power and personage in both life and in the underworld.
Thank you, Dax. So, last speaker, not least certainly, of tonight, Filippo. Filippo is attending a doctoral program in comparative literature at CUNY Graduate Center. His more recent research focused on the category of the contrappasso. He also worked on the rhetoric of silence in the episode of Jerry Del Bello and Lucifer. About his presentation, titled Boundaries Becoming Prisons, Origins and Semantics of the Infernal Rivers. By exploring the peculiar origin of the infernal rivers, Filippo will try to show how they work as a structuring device in the narrative of Dante's journey, conceived to connect the persistence of evil in the universe to the moral decay of mankind. Please welcome Filippo.
Thank you, Stefano. Good to see you again. As Stefano underlined, my research focused upon the rivers that Dante encounters in his journey through hell: the Acheron, the Styx, the Phlegethon, and the Cocytus. This representation of hell is by Sandro Botticelli, and it helps us to grasp how, encompassing virtually all of the abyss, the river system constitutes a visually unifying element that acts as the most prominent feature of the infernal landscape. Acheron, the first river, lies near the boundary of hell, where the mythological figure of Charon ferries the souls who died in God's wrath. Styx identifies a second boundary, that of low hell. Here, another ferryman, Phlegas, bears the pilgrims across the swampy waters and the wrathful and slothful souls who are in. Moving forward, the sinners of violence against others are immersed at various depths in the boiling hot blood of the Phlegethon that Dante crosses on the back of the centaur Nexus. Finally, Cocytus arises from the confluence of the cascades of the other rivers. Since it looks like a frozen lake, pilgrims cross it on foot. These rivers work as geographical boundaries, yes, but at one as an instrument of punishment, contributing to the tragic fulfillment of divine justice. But it's not hellish punishment I will talk about. Kate faced brilliantly the topic tonight. Today I would like to deepen the origin of the infernal waters, an aspect that is often relegated to the margins of reflection, even if it could be precious in clarifying the moral structure of Dante's hell. Dante stresses the importance of this feature when the two pilgrims are in the sixth circle. Moving away from the violent against others, the river Phlegethon runs alongside the gloomy forest made up of those who have committed violence against themselves, the suicides. Later, the watercourse emerges between the banks of the last circle, an expanse of sand on which a rain of fire falls. This fire falls as placid as snow, but its effect is devastating, The flakes make the sand red hot and burn the flesh of blasphemers, sodomites, and usurers. In this scenario, the pilgrims witness something extraordinary. The vapors rising from the stream of the fire extinguish the fiery flakes that fall on the desert, and in doing so, they identify a safe path for the two wayfarers. To clarify the nature of this stream, Dante elaborates a simile. As from the Bulicame flows out a rivulet that sinful women that divide among them, so these run down across the sand. The Bulicame was a sulfurous thermal spring located near Viterbo. This is a picture of the Bulicame today. The waters of this stream were known for their healing properties and were particularly popular. The thermal tourism around the Bulicame produced cases of prostitution where the peccatrici, the sinful women, took advantage of the hot water to wash themselves, compromising the purity of the stream. That being the case, the author suggests here that as the waters of Bulicame were infested by passing through the prostitution houses, in the same way, here the infernal waters should be polluted by the presence of the damned souls. As we will see shortly, this could not be a random observation. But what is most surprising is Virgil's comment. Your eyes have yet seen nothing of such note as this stream before us. How is this possible? I mean, the two pilgrims have already crossed 6 of the 9 circles of hell. They met the last fool blown by the wind, the monstrous 3-headed dog that feeds on soil, men transformed into trees, able to speak, and other men boiling in a river of blood. They met even harpies and the centaurs, and yet, according to Virgil, Dante would not have seen anything as remarkable as that stream. Why? The answer, in my opinion, is in the following verses, where Virgil explains the origin of the infernal rivers. The remarkability would then not be attributed to the ability of the vapors to extinguish the fiery flakes, but to the nature of the hydrographic system. Indeed, the Latin poet immediately explains how the statue of a huge old man is in the depths of Mount Ida on the island of Crete. The parts of this statue are made up of different materials. The head is of gold, the arms and chest are of silver, the torso is of copper, and the legs and the left foot are of iron. Finally, the right foot is of terracotta. From the chest down, there is also a crack from which tears flow. They penetrate the rock and accumulate underground, giving rise to the infernal rivers. To understand the meaning of this representation, we must look at its sources. In particular, Dante combines a biblical passage from the book of prophet Daniel with a famous excerpt from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The biblical text describes a statue that appears in a dream to Nebuchadnezzar. The composite nature of that figure is almost identical to that of Dante's statue. And Daniel reads the various materials of the statue as representing different regimes, in particular, the empire of Nebuchadnezzar and the 3 kingdoms that would follow it. The Ovidian text, instead, develops a recurring motif of the Greco-Roman imaginary, the conception of the history of humanity as a history of decadence. Actually, it doesn't talk of its text about the statue, but it talks about Crete as cradle of human race and the place of propagation of the Golden Age. This prosperous and carefree era would have been succeeded by the progressively deteriorating ages of silver, bronze, and iron. An interesting point is that Ovid indicates the succession of the various ages of mankind by the same metals as the biblical tale. Dante knew for sure the myth of the Golden Age because he mentions it twice in Purgatorio, where he identifies the primordial age of the classical tradition with the era in which mankind lived in the earthly paradise. The activation of the classical model is pivotal because it distances Dante's text from the biblical model. The metals that make up the various parts of the statue correspond to the ages of human civilization and not to a succession of kingdoms, as in the biblical text. Furthermore, while the biblical statue has each of the feet made up of both iron and terracotta, the old man has one foot of iron and the other, on which the statue lays, of terracotta, a poor material that could represent the present age. But the most original hallmark of Dante's representation is another. Each part of the statue has a crack that sheds tears. Such a wound is missing the golden part, and this prompts us to recognize in the cracks in the tears the product of the moral decay that marked the end of the Golden Age. In the biblical dream, the fracture is caused by a stone, which is said not to come from human hands. Dante's text, instead, by using the word lacrimae, tears, chooses a term eager to point out the responsibility of mankind. The Bible did not indicate where the statue was. Dante, drawing from Ovid, does so. The source of the Inferno rivers is inside the mountain of the island of Crete. It means that Mount Ida is conceived as one of those spaces, frequent in the imagination of the classical world, where the presence of the divine is realized on earth. A point of contact, I would say, a kind of a portal between the present world and the afterlife. It is no accident that the source of the infernal waters is dentro dal monte, inside the mountain. The underground origin of watercourse has always been evident to humans, and from this observation, humans deduce that, as underground, water is connected to the world of the dead soul. Moreover, the liquid nature of the property and the property of moving from one place to another have suggested the ability of water to act as a vector between the underworld and the inhabited surface. If we consider this quality, Dante's operation appears even more deliberate. The poet is telling us that the infernal rivers originate in our world and that the transfer of sinful forces would not go from the afterlife to this world, but from earth toward the year after. However, not all the waters of hell come from Crete. There is a stream that, through a tortuous tunnel, descends from the mountain purgatory to the bottom of hell. The text does not say that this little stream flows in the Cocytus, but we can deduce that because it would have nowhere else to go. The text also doesn't say where this stream comes from, but we can suppose that it comes from Lite or Eunoe, since there are no other sources in Purgatory. Lite and Eunoe are two rivers in the Purgatorio. If, as many believe, these waters comes from the Lite, we would get the last piece. The Lite is, in fact, the river of earthly paradise where penitent souls bathe to wash away the memory of their sins. As Daniel Dono explains, this means that by falling towards the center of the earth, the memory of sin that survives the penitential ascent flows back towards Lucifer, the root cause of all sin. Like the little stream in Inferno 14, the Lite is a sort of bulicame, a river polluted by sin. In this way, Dante would create a perfect geographical and moral symmetry, where the river system functions as a topographical metaphor showing the consequences of sin, a vector through which human suffering flows back to its primordial cause. And if tears of the old men of Crete fall, it is because something has weighed them down, and this could be the sin. In the last canto of Hell, Virgil relates the morphology of the earth and of hell to the fall of Lucifer. In doing so, the text seems to shift the terminus postquem, the beginning of the existence of evil, from the moment of Adam and Eve's transgression in the Eden to the moment of the rebellion of Lucifer. However, the fall of Lucifer causes the conformation of hell only in part. Everything else is the effect of the erosive action of those waters that move as a result of human decay, pushed down by the burden of sin. This underlines how the persistence of evil in the creation is also due to the actions of human beings. In short, Dante's invention of an infernal hydrographic system would contribute to nail sinners to their responsibility, that of creators and maintainers of the infernal reality. Thank you so much.
Grazie, Filippo. So, let's go to the fun part. Am I allowed to say that? I don't know. A little bit more fun. So, I mean, honestly, I had a presentation, but don't worry about it. I'm going to be very brief. I'm even going to skip a few things. I think that'll take not even 5 minutes. So first, I will start with a brief story. Everything started on a coffee break in between classes. One of my professors at the time, Paolo Borsa, was talking about a Dante movie made in 1911. I quote him from memory. The silent movie is really interesting. There is no official score, as the material score, the one was written for the movie, got lost. Several renditions have been made during decades, but none has been established officially. So I told my professor as a joke, well, then maybe we could try to write something for it. As it happens, the project ended soon. I was looking for people to help me, but no one seemed to have enough time for it. After 1 year, I finally found Matteo Ongaro and Sergio Simona, to which I'm really thankful. They couldn't be here. That helped me to start the project. In writing, recording, and editing the music, no amount of money was spent. For 6 months, we would be in my room in Switzerland, especially during the night, since we were writing our master dissertation during the day, and we created Discorso in scene by scene. Just a few things. The movie is made of 54 scenes, which are introduced by intertitles or title cards, which are typical of silent movies, such as this one. This one. The main iconographic model of the film is Gustave Doré's illustration for the Inferno di Dante Alighieri, 1861, and the first Italian edition, 1868. And in various passages, the film can be considered certainly as a dynamic version of Doré's static depictions. Just a few examples. The Three Beasts, Virgil and Beatrice, Charon, Minos in Inferno 5, the Inferno Hurricane, of the last fall, Cerberus, Geryon, Bertrand the Barn, and Lucifer. Yeah, you will see that later. So I'll skip a few things, as I promised. So, this is important to say. The last scene of the movie, I think, catches the viewer somewhat by surprise today because of its extra narrative character. The image of Dante's statue in Trento, accompanied by the inscription Onorate l'altissimo poeta, which is taken from Inferno 4, verse 880, where it refers to Virgil, and also present on Dante's cenotaph in Santa Croce, Florence, on the left corner of the entrance. The image carries a clear irredentist message. The monument, in fact, facing the Bernero Pass, had been erected in 1896 as a symbol of Italian language and culture, in ideal opposition to the one dedicated in Bolzano, in 1889 to the medieval German poet Walter von der Vogelweide, and is therefore highly problematic today. We are thus facing a political use with the blessing of the Dante Alighieri National Society and Giuseppe Carducci of the figure and work of Dante, which after the Great War would be widely developed in the fascist era. So, an interesting fact about this, the final scene, this one, before this scene, there is the ascent of Dante and Virgil outside of hell. And this was one of the first pieces that we wrote. And we had the intention to make it very celebrative and grandiose. But then a few seconds after, there is this message. So we were put in front of a problem. Like how to celebrate the exit from hell and at the same time acknowledge the problematic message that follows. As you will hear, we decided for a satirical approach. I don't know what you will think about it, but maybe you can tell me later. So last thing, just some indication about the score. In the scene where Beatrice asked Virgil to help Dante in Inferno 2, we decided to sing the Psalm 31 in Te Domine Speravi, referenced by Dante in Canto III of Purgatorio after the appearance of Beatrice. In the Limbo scene, we made an arrangement of some of the verses present in Canto 4. Lost are we and are only so far punished, that without hope we live on in desire, that they sin not, and if they married had this not enough, because they had not baptism, and etc. In Pluto's scene, we decided to give voice to his invocation of the power of Satan in a particular manner, as you will hear. And the final scene, I'll talk about that, so I think we're ready.